In the year 260 AD, a Roman merchant held two coins. Both bore the emperor's face. Both were stamped with imperial authority. Both were legal tender across the empire, but one contained 50% silver. The other, minted just 20 years earlier, contained 90% silver. The merchant knew this. So did everyone else in the marketplace. The official proclamation insisted they had equal value. Reality disagreed. This wasn't a crisis moment. It was a slow recognition, spread across decades, as trust in the currency quietly dissolved along with the silver content. And in that dissolution, something revealing happened. People adapted. Not through rebellion or collapse, but through innovation, finding alternatives, creating parallel systems, anchoring value in different forms. Currency is typically experienced as dependable, a background constant like gravity. Its value fluctuates moderately, but the basic function remains, a means to exchange, to store value, to coordinate economic activity. Yet this dependability is not intrinsic. It rests on trust, and trust can erode. When it does, the question becomes, what endures? To understand what happens when currency loses trust, it helps to enter the worldview of societies where money was not yet abstract, where the connection between coin and value felt tangible. In the Roman Empire at its height, currency was more than a convenience. It was a symbol of imperial power, a physical manifestation of Rome's reach and authority. Coins carried the emperor's image, stamped with divine titles and military victories. To hold a Roman denarius was to hold a piece of the empire itself, portable, universally recognized, backed by the greatest military and administrative apparatus the world had known. The denarius was not merely silver. It was trust made tangible. Merchants from Britain to Egypt accepted it without question. Soldiers received it as pay and could spend it anywhere the legions marched. Tax collectors demanded it, and farmers sold grain to obtain it. The entire economic structure of the empire rested on the assumption that these coins represented stable value. This assumption depended on predictability. A denarius contained a certain weight of silver. That content was verified by the emperor's seal, by the reputation of Rome's mints, by centuries of consistent practice. Citizens didn't need to test each coin. They trusted the system, but trust is fragile. It requires maintenance, consistent standards, honest institutions, alignment between declaration and reality. When that alignment breaks, when the coin's content no longer matches its face value, trust begins to fracture. Rome experienced this fracture slowly over generations. It began in the 3rd century during a period of political instability. Emperors rose and fell rapidly, often violently. Civil wars drained resources. Barbarian invasions threatened borders. The military required constant funding. Tax revenue, though extracted aggressively, proved insufficient. The solution emperors found was debasement, reducing the precious metal content of coins while maintaining their nominal value. This allowed more coins to be minted from the same amount of silver, effectively creating money to meet immediate needs. In the short term, it worked. Soldiers were paid, supplies were purchased, the empire continued to function. But the long-term consequences unfolded gradually as citizens and merchants noticed what was happening. The coins felt lighter. They looked different, less lustrous, more coppery. When tested, they revealed their reduced silver content. And slowly, the trust that had sustained the currency for centuries began to erode. The Roman denarius, when first introduced by Augustus around 211 BC, contained approximately 95% silver. This high purity was maintained for centuries, becoming the foundation of commercial trust across the Mediterranean world. By the reign of Nero in the mid-1st century AD, the silver content had been reduced to around 90%. Still substantial, and the reduction was gradual enough not to cause immediate alarm. But the precedent was established. When fiscal pressures mounted, emperors could adjust the coinage. The real acceleration came in the 3rd century. Under Septimius Severus, 193–211 AD, the denarius dropped to roughly 50% silver. His son Caracalla attempted to address this by introducing a new coin, the Antoninianus, theoretically worth 2 denarii but containing only about 1/5 times the silver. The arithmetic didn't fool anyone, but the coin circulated by imperial decree. By the 260s, during the crisis of the 3rd century, the silver content had plummeted to around 5%. The silver coins were essentially bronze with a thin silver wash. The pretense of maintaining value was transparent, but the legal fiction continued. Emperors insisted these coins retain their face value. Markets quietly disagreed. The human response to this situation was not uniform collapse but adaptive diversification. several patterns emerged simultaneously. First, a dual pricing system developed informally. Merchants accepted debased currency but adjusted prices accordingly. Goods that once cost 1 denarius now cost 3 or 5, implicitly recognizing the coin's reduced real value. This was not official policy. It was spontaneous coordination among market participants responding to reality. Second, old coins, those with higher silver content, disappeared from circulation. Individuals hoarded them, melting them down for their metal value, or using them for specific transactions where real value mattered. This pattern, later formalized as Gresham's law, emerged naturally from individual incentives. Why spend good money when bad money is legally required to be accepted equally? Third, barter increased. In regions where currency had become too unreliable, direct exchange of goods resurged. Farmers traded grain directly for tools. Artisans exchanged services. Urban markets developed complex webs of reciprocal obligation that bypassed currency entirely. This was less efficient than monetary exchange, but more trustworthy. Fourth, alternative stores of value gained prominence. Gold, always valuable, became even more sought after as silver currency degraded. Land, which couldn't be debased, became a preferred form of wealth storage. Grain and other storable commodities served as practical reserves. The diversification was pragmatic. When official currency can't be trusted, value must be anchored elsewhere. Fifth, local systems emerged. Some regions and communities developed their own unofficial means of exchange, tokens, promissory notes, or simply systems of recorded credit. These lacked the legal authority of imperial coinage, but they functioned because participants trusted each other more than they trusted distant emperors. The state attempted to control these adaptations. Emperor Diocletian, ruling from 284 to 305 AD, issued the edict on maximum prices in 301, attempting to fix prices throughout the empire and impose the nominal value of debased currency by legal force. The edict was detailed, listing maximum prices for hundreds of goods and services with death penalties for violations. It failed. The edict was largely ignored or circumvented. Goods disappeared from official markets and reappeared in unofficial ones. Enforcement was spotty and expensive. Within years, the edict was effectively abandoned, a monument to the limits of legal compulsion against economic reality. Diocletian also attempted currency reform, introducing new coins with higher metallic content. This succeeded partially, restoring some confidence, but the fundamental problem, fiscal demands exceeding resources, remained. Future emperors continued to debase, and the cycle repeated. The unintended outcome was structural diversification. The Roman economy, once tightly integrated around a single currency system, became more fragmented and localized. Long-distance trade continued but relied increasingly on gold or direct commodity exchange rather than silver coinage. Local economies developed greater self-sufficiency, less dependent on imperial currency. This diversification had consequences for imperial cohesion. The currency had been a unifying force, a tangible link between distant provinces and the central authority. As its reliability declined, so did one of the subtle bonds holding the empire together. This was not the sole cause of Rome's eventual fragmentation, but it was a contributing factor, a quiet erosion of institutional trust that preceded political collapse. Yet collapse was not universal or immediate. The eastern portion of the empire, which became Byzantium, reformed its currency under Constantine in the early 4th century, introducing the gold solidus. This coin maintained high purity for centuries, becoming the foundation of Byzantine economic stability and trade dominance. The lesson was clear. Stable currency required fiscal discipline and institutional integrity. When those conditions were met, trust could be restored. In the West, where political stability proved elusive, adaptation continued along different paths. As central authority weakened, localized systems became the norm. Medieval Europe inherited this fragmentation, developing diverse monetary arrangements, feudal obligations, commodity standards, and eventually, new coinage systems backed by emerging nation-states. The pattern throughout was human adaptability. Official currency failed to maintain trust, but economic life continued. People found alternatives, created workarounds, anchored value in forms they could verify. The process was gradual, often messy, sometimes inequitable. Those with resources diversified more effectively than the poor, but it demonstrated resilience. The quiet consequence was that currency, once the unquestioned medium of exchange, became one option among several. Its role diminished in proportion to its unreliability, and what endured was not the official monetary system, but the underlying human need to coordinate exchange and store value, needs that found expression through whatever means proved trustworthy. The Roman experience reveals patterns that recur across monetary crises throughout history, patterns rooted in consistent aspects of human behavior and systemic dynamics. The first is the preference for tangible anchors. When currency becomes abstract, when its face value diverges significantly from its intrinsic or verifiable worth, people seek alternatives they can assess directly. In Rome, this meant hoarding old silver coins, accumulating gold, acquiring land. The tangibility offered psychological comfort. These assets had value independent of official declarations. This pattern reflects a deeper truth about trust. Currency trust is institutional. It depends on faith in authorities and systems. Tangible asset trust is direct. It depends on properties one can verify personally. When institutional trust erodes, direct trust becomes more appealing, even when less convenient. A second pattern involves spontaneous emergence of parallel systems. Rome's informal dual pricing, local credit networks, and increased barter were not centrally planned. They arose organically as individuals sought workable solutions to the problem of unreliable currency. This emergence demonstrates that economic coordination doesn't require reliable official currency. It simply becomes more localized and less efficient without it. The resilience embedded in this pattern is noteworthy. Societies experiencing currency collapse don't simply cease functioning. They reorganize, finding alternative mechanisms to fulfill the functions currency once served. The transition may be chaotic and inequitable, but it occurs. Human ingenuity in coordinating exchange adapts to constraints. A third pattern is the limitation of legal enforcement against economic reality. Diocletian's price edict exemplifies this. No matter how severe the penalties, markets resist compelled adherence to prices that diverge from underlying supply and demand. Enforcement becomes prohibitively expensive, and evasion becomes universal. This pattern suggests that monetary systems function well only when they align with participants' voluntary acceptance. Coerced currency acceptance, divorced from genuine trust or value, generates parallel markets and evasion. Sustainable monetary systems rest ultimately on confidence, not compulsion. A fourth pattern relates to inequalities amplification during currency crises. Those with resources and knowledge diversify effectively, moving wealth into gold, land, and storable commodities. Those without such resources remain trapped in the failing currency system, watching their savings erode. The wealthy can opt out, the poor cannot. This dynamic isn't unique to currency crises, but such crises make it starkly visible. The architecture of currency systems, when failing, reveals and exacerbates existing inequalities. Adaptation is available to everyone in principle, but in practice it's easiest for those with surplus resources and information. A fifth pattern is the long lag between institutional failure and systemic reorganization. Rome's currency degraded over decades, even centuries, before full adaptation occurred. During this lag, inefficiency multiplied, hoarding removed good coins from circulation, barter required costly coincidence of wants, localized systems fragmented markets. The transition was neither quick nor clean. This temporal pattern matters because it means currency failures are experienced not as discrete events, but as prolonged processes. Societies exist for extended periods in states of partial trust, where currency still circulates but with diminishing confidence, where alternatives proliferate but inefficiently, where the old system hasn't fully collapsed but no longer functions optimally. These patterns, preference for tangible anchors, spontaneous parallel systems, limits of legal enforcement, amplified inequality, and prolonged transition, repeat across contexts. They are not particular to Rome or any specific technology. They reflect fundamental aspects of how humans coordinate economic activity when institutional structures prove unreliable. The echoes of these patterns appear throughout subsequent centuries, in contexts diverse but recognizably similar. Medieval Europe, inheriting Rome's fragmentation, operated for centuries with highly localized currency systems. Kings minted coins, but their acceptance often extended only as far as the king's effective authority. Long-distance merchants developed sophisticated credit instruments, bills of exchange, promissory notes, that functioned effectively where coinage was unreliable or too risky to transport. These instruments depended on reputation networks rather than sovereign backing. Later periods of monetary stress saw similar adaptations. The European inflations following massive silver inflows from the Americas in the 16th century prompted diversification into land and commodities. The disruptions of the Napoleonic Wars saw British merchants relying on gold and complex credit arrangements when continental currencies fluctuated unpredictably. In each case, the response followed familiar contours: flight to tangible assets, development of alternative exchange mechanisms, increased localization of economic networks, and gradual emergence of restored trust only when institutional reforms aligned declared value with reality. The 20th century's extreme inflations, Germany in the 1920s, Hungary in the 1940s, numerous episodes in Latin America and Africa demonstrated that even paper currency, theoretically more controllable than metallic coinage, could lose trust completely. In these cases, the adaptation was rapid. Foreign currencies became preferred, barter flourished, commodity standards emerged spontaneously. The mechanisms were ancient, but the speed accelerated by modern communication. Even in less extreme cases, whenever currency reliability declined, the same patterns surfaced: diversification, parallel markets, preference for external anchors. The specific forms varied with technology and context: digital alternatives in recent decades, commodity futures, inflation-protected securities, but the underlying impulse remained consistent. The observation is simple: trust, once eroded, reconstitutes slowly and only when underlying conditions change. Adaptation continues throughout the interim, driven by individual incentives and constrained by available alternatives. No single solution dominates. Instead, a portfolio of strategies emerges, reflecting both human ingenuity and the persistent need to coordinate economic activity. These echoes are not offered as predictions, but as patterns visible across time, suggesting something consistent about human responses to monetary institutional failure. The question posed at the beginning, what endures when currency loses trust, has an answer visible across centuries of historical experience. What endures is not the currency itself, nor the institutions that issue it, but the underlying human need to exchange, to store value, to coordinate economic activity across time and space. When official systems fail to serve these needs reliably, alternatives emerge, sometimes inefficiently, sometimes inequitably, but persistently. This emergence reflects ingenuity constrained by circumstance. People cannot simply will a reliable currency into existence, but they can adapt, finding substitutes that serve well enough. The adaptations reveal what people genuinely value: tangibility over abstraction when trust is scarce, flexibility over efficiency when reliability is uncertain, local networks over distant authorities when institutions prove unreliable. The lesson is not prescriptive. It does not suggest currency failures are harmless or easily overcome. They impose real costs, amplify inequalities, and reduce economic efficiency. But they do not eliminate human capacity to organize exchange. When currency falters, what endures is what people value, and the quiet, persistent ingenuity through which they find new ways to coordinate around it. Rome's experience and the echoes that followed demonstrate that monetary systems are tools, not foundations. When tools fail, humans build new ones. The process is neither smooth nor inevitable, but it is remarkably consistent. If this perspective shifted how currency appears, not as an inevitable constant, but as a trust-dependent tool, there are other questions worth exploring. How do societies rebuild monetary trust once lost? What role does memory play in currency acceptance? History offers more than most modern debates acknowledge. Thank you for your time. These patterns matter and they reward careful attention.